Good morning, my name is Helen Miller and I'm Assistant Governance Relations at GRI. Welcome to the second day of this in-person meeting of the Global Sustainability Standards Board, known by its acronym the GSSB, held on 21st September 2017. This in-person meeting is being held in Amsterdam, the Netherlands. Please note that all public GSSB meetings are being recorded and you can find the audio recording on the GSSB website along with high-level summaries of previous GSSB meetings. Present from the GRI Secretariat today are Bastian Buck, Director, Standards Division, Tamara Bergkamp, Manager Standards, and Pamela Carpio, Senior Coordinator, Governance Relations. We'll now start with a roll call. Attila Yerlikaya.
Present.
Daniel Ingram.
Present.
Dwight Justice.
Present.
Evan Harvey.
Present.
Julia Wilson.
Present.
Jürgen Buxbaum.
Present.
Ken Swift.
Present.
Kirsten Margrethe Hovey.
Present.
Michelle Wascher.
Present.
Robin Leeson.
Present.
Stian Vandrach.
Present.
Sulema Pioli.
Present.
Vadakepat Nankumar.
Present.
And Judy Kuszewski, GSSB Chair.
I'm here too.
Thank you, everyone. We would like to note that GSSB member Daniel Tailang sends his apologies for today's meeting. I'll now hand over to the Chair, Judy Kuszewski, to open the meeting.
Thank you very much, Helen. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for your prompt arrival this morning. We have, as you know, we have done a little bit of shifting around of things on our agenda. So we'd like, first of all, to take a quick look at what we're going to do on today's agenda. So we have held over from yesterday, doesn't appear on the slide here. We have held over from yesterday the update from the Sustainable Stock Exchanges program, which Evan Harvey is going to talk us through, and then also a short period of just kind of reflection and discussion among the GSSB members regarding the variety of messages that we heard yesterday. Before we start then going into our main thing we want to accomplish today, which is to look at our project priorities and our work plan going forward. We are nevertheless aiming to end at around 3 o'clock in the afternoon today. So I hope that we can push forward quite efficiently on the discussions today. Does this make sense to everyone? Okay, well, with that in mind, I think what we will do is just turn it straight over to Evan. Do we have a slide package? Evan, no? Okay, thanks. So over to you.
But I'm happy to provide this report to the group afterwards. So I just wanted to provide a short overview of what's going on with the stock exchanges, how they intersect with the regulatory regimes in various economies, and also some of the things that are crossing our path in terms of drivers in the corporate reporting space and outside of the corporate reporting space. So first and foremost, there are two main stock exchange working groups driving listing regulations, guidance, best practices, the United Nations Sustainable Stock Exchange Initiative and the WFE Sustainability Working Group. Both of those groups publish annual reviews on their website. I encourage you to look there for more information on what I'm going to tell you. This is a summary of some of the things you can find in those two reports. Those two documents are also in your meeting packet for today, too. In fact, I would say that one of them is mismarked as the WFP paper, but it's actually WFE paper. So listing guidance, let's start there. 65, or about 82 stock exchanges in the world, depending on how you count. That's how most people count. 65 of them, or 80%, are in one of those two working groups. So there's an overwhelming preponderance of stock exchanges working towards more sustainability disclosure in one way, shape, or form. 58 of those 82 stock exchanges, or 70%, are publicly committed to better sustainability reporting. So they either have it in place, they're working on it now, or they have signed a letter of commitment saying they are going to do it. As of today, 12 out of 82 have ESG listing rules. It's about 15%. This includes exchanges in Brazil, Canada, Hong Kong, India, Malaysia, Singapore, South Africa, Thailand, and others. Rules may soon be coming for LSE in Istanbul. That's a possibility. 15 out of 82, or 18%, have formal ESG guidance on the books. 23 out of 82 are in process. So by year end, we could have about 46%, roughly half of the exchanges with formal ESG guidance. Products and services, the story is a little bit brighter. 38 of the 82 exchanges, or 46%, have ESG-themed index products. Is that a question, or is that just background?
Yes, I can hear you now.
Okay, so no, we can hear each other, but we can't hear the...
Oh, they can't hear me?
This is probably time calling in.
Keep going or start over?
Please keep going.
Okay.
Please keep going.
All right, so, and 11 of the 82 now list green bonds, 14%. In terms of the policy landscape, you heard this number yesterday, 30 out of 50 of the largest country economies have ESG disclosure regulations on the books. That has a direct impact and will have a continuing impact on exchange operations. Inevitably, we follow these regulator signals. I'm going to zoom in a little bit on the Nordic market. You heard about this yesterday. We published ESG reporting guide in Q1 of this year for all of our Nordic and Baltic markets, including Sweden, Finland, Denmark, Iceland, Armenia, et cetera. This document made the business case for 33 ESG indicators, most of which are modeled very closely on GRI standards. In fact, they launched with G4 citations, and it's since been updated to map to the standards. We also included First North market in that launch because that's a small cap market. We're trying to bring small and medium enterprises along in the reporting process. We've had over 11,000 views of that document or downloads since publication. And then last month in Stockholm, we launched a pilot program asking companies to participate in a year-long pilot of understanding around the use of that guide and how it has or has not improved communication with investors and other stakeholders. We expect to get about 10 companies. We now have over 40. The pilot program will run from September 2017 through September 2018. We'll be doing periodic check-ins and a public report of the experiences at the end. Curiously, of all those pilot company volunteers, only Denmark is underrepresented. Only one company from Denmark so far, so that's the only outlier in that group. U.S. market update. This will be a bit briefer. NASDAQ in the U.S., for the U.S. equities market, published a paper called The Promise of Market Reform in Q2, which was focused on three things: modernizing market structure, post-crisis financial regulatory reform, and of course, promoting long-termism. There's a discussion of ESG and materiality standards in the promoting long-termism portion of the paper. If you haven't seen it, I encourage you to look at it. NYSE has published a sustainability resource mini website for their listed companies, a public website that points to relevant research and links, including GRI and the standards prominently featured. I'll leave it there. We have the same thing. And then, interestingly, in the US, we now have the engagement of the commodities exchanges. So CME, CBOE, and ICE have been members of the WFE working group from the start, and they've patiently sat through 2 years of wrestling around issuer disclosure regulation discussion, not knowing when and where they were going to get into the conversation. Now, the WFE and other groups are turning our focus to green bonds and sustainable financial instruments, particularly the proper governance for those instruments, and the commodities exchanges are more in the discussion, which I think is a good development. Moving beyond corporate disclosure, exchanges as drivers of sustainable development, we're part of the EU high-level expert group on sustainable finance. You heard a bit about that yesterday. We were one of the drivers behind another working group at the SSE, a green finance working group, which has published a paper of recommendations. And then I want to call your attention to one more paper, a joint paper between the WFE and UNCTAD, the United Nations Council on Trade and Development, called The Role of Stock Exchanges in Fostering Economic Growth and Sustainable Development, a pretty good state of the world in terms of what stock exchanges can and should do in terms of driving sustainable development over the long term. Two core suppositions in that paper: exchanges are responsible for the mobilization of capital, especially in some cases for SMEs, and exchanges have a role to promote in good governance and creating more good governance. And the paper concludes that there are fundamental driver opportunities for exchanges in the green bond space, ESG-themed index and ETF space, and of course, ESG reporting standards and practices. The one thing that I would add that's not in the paper is I think you're finding exchanges driving better data protocols on ESG data, better and more consistent calculation methodologies. You heard about the TCFD yesterday. It has certainly gotten a lot of attention in the exchange community. Singapore Exchange was a member of the TCFD, actually the vice chair of that group. So we've gotten a lot of information from the TCFD to the exchange community during the process. It seems to be most important to us because we hear from institutional investors about lack of data standardization as the #1 inhibitor of sustainable capital flow. There's a State Street paper from 2017 that makes this case pretty clearly. They surveyed almost 600 institutional investors, and it was the most cited reason for a continuing impediment to sustainable capital flow, the lack of data standards. The TCFD recommendations focus on governance, strategy, risk management, metrics, and targets. And in terms of exchanges, the reporting gaps, I was talking about this a little bit with Bastian yesterday, the reporting gaps between TCFD and the exchange community seem to be on these two areas of robust scenario planning and impact forecasting. Those are two reporting areas that the exchanges have not taken up at all. We think they're interesting, and we want to know how to do a better job with that, but it has not been part of the discussion so far. And then last but not least, moving beyond company ESG reporting, exchanges are certainly, if I can speak for them, heartened by this new era of cooperation and concordance between these standard-setting bodies and reporting organizations, GRI in particular, working with SASB, CDP, the SDGs, and now the TCFD. It makes our job easier if you are coming to an agreement on what the right reporting protocols are. There's been a lot of pressure that we have seen on investors to become more transparent on ESG. The most recent instance of this was a share action letter by 262 of the world's largest banks, from Candriam and Hermes and a number of others, asking them to disclose their climate risks and opportunities over the long term. And that paper concludes that something on the order of 93 trillion USD is going to be needed in investment by 2030 if we're going to transition to a low carbon economy. So those kinds of numbers get a lot of people's attention, especially in the exchange community where we're fostering this relationship between companies and potential investors. So I'll leave it there, and I'll make this available if anybody wants it, because the links to all the papers that I cited are in this doc.
Any questions for Evan, also to do with the papers that were provided as pre-reading, if you had a chance to look at those? Any comments, questions, observations? Yeah.
Just one comment. In the way we report, we don't use the SDGs as a framework. We more consider it to be the official list of priorities of governments and non-governmental organizations. So it's an input in our materiality analysis and a point on which we report in the stakeholder engagement part. Because today we have no evidence that it's a priority for investors or for employees or other stakeholders.
View on that, Evan? No.
I agree.
Any others? Yeah, Daniel.
Thank you for the update, Evan. Very helpful. Just interested to try to get your sense of the interaction between the stock exchanges and the securities regulators in various countries and their involvement. Do you get the sense that there's more involvement from the regulators, or are they just sort of happy to see how the market responds in this case?
Well, I think it depends on the regulator. I mean, from the WFE working group point of view, we have been trying to work through IOSCO because you get to a lot of regulators at once. That seems to have been the most fruitful avenue, and the conversation has been much more engaging over the last year and a half than it was prior to that. Individual regulators we have mixed history with engaging with one by one.
Any other points to raise? Thank you, Evan. That was very interesting and obviously quite relevant to the kind of wider context discussion for the GSSB. And what we want to do now is spend a little bit of time just reflecting. We might have to remind ourselves a little bit about the various topics and themes that we reviewed yesterday and that we heard about over the course of yesterday. So, and we need to kind of keep in mind the current set of activities that the Standards Division is leading us on, as well as the wider context, including the GRI strategy. We had the update from the TCFD. We are looking at the issues raised during the monitoring program over the first year of the uptake of the GRI standards. And I wondered if anyone had any kind of just takeaways from the last day's discussion that you'd like to raise for us to be thinking about while we move into the future discussion of our priorities and work plan. Michel.
Just a short one. I think we should expect the work on human rights to take more time than what has been initially planned.
Okay. Julia.
And I also think the information we got yesterday about reporters having difficulty with materiality and management approach and some things is really important to continue to look at, because if the reporting standards aren't used as we intend, you know, that's an issue in and of itself. So just something to keep our eyes on.
And we might consider the extent to which that's inherent in the standards versus, you know, a kind of wider ecosystem issue with training and just time, you know, to some extent, because they're complicated concepts. Kent.
You know, when Tim was speaking, he sort of offered us an additional agenda to what we're already working on, and I was kind of wondering about, you know, how we would prioritize that within the things that we're already doing.
Yep. Suleima?
I was thinking about the materiality issue regarding the difficulty of the reporters to follow the rules of materiality, boundary, and to report on management approach. And I really think that we should think about reinforced training the trainers. I've been attending some partnering training sessions in Brazil. There's a lot of confusion in terms of mainly about the impact issue. So there are some trainers repeating, and they are consultants, repeating that the impact that the company should take care, it's the impact on their business. So it's just an example. Boundary is a mess. But boundary is also a mess. Oh, sorry. I will restrain myself, but boundary is also a mess because the companies, the global ones, they do have some challenge in terms of correctly profiling their supply chain. Maybe we should start to think about guidance on how to better profile supply chain and then better identify impacts from supply chain. In terms of management approach, I really think there's a difficulty regarding the managing some critical issues. So there are some impacts that companies are aware of, but they're not managing. So reporting against their impacts or using the GRI standards is more about transparency. It's not about being the best company in the world. Maybe we should reinforce this message. Be transparent. It doesn't matter if you're not that good in some areas, but what does matter is being transparent.
Kirsten.
I certainly agree with Suleima that training the trainers is a very important topic. That's on a general basis, but it's also based on some of the questions I see come in to the standards department from the trainers, and questions I have received directly from trainers and questions I've received from those who have received training by the trainers. There is something about the understanding of how literally everything should be read. The need for being able to, as I usually say, to think yourself, if we should add some sort of an intellectual flexibility into it to make it possible to use the standards in different contexts, even when you are in an area where they aren't directly made for. And I see that that seems to be a real challenge today.
Nan-Kumar.
I think I echo what Suleiman and Christian said. My personal experience, I underwent the training on the GRI G4, one of the training partners. And not only me, but entire DNV a team of senior management in DNV. And our experience was the training was very poor. And finally, I had to repeat the training for my team separately. And this is not only echoed by DNV itself, but also by the others for whom I offer the not advisory, the verification. They say that the training is very watered down. Training does not tell us very clearly how to do about materiality, how to do a stakeholder engagement. Each trainer brings his own perspective. So there is no single perspective, so we are confused. I suggest it will be good that I have found that the GRI's e-learning course much better than the one offered by the GRI trainers, or what do you call that, accredited trainers of GRI. So I suggest that there should be some quality check and some way of ensuring that the quality training is important. Thank you.
Michel.
Yes, I just wanted to comment that, I mean, again, as a reporter, the guidance of GRI on how to do a materiality analysis is very limited. It's basically one chart which tells you that you need to list aspects without guidance on how to do so, prioritize them without guidance on how to prioritize, validate and take into account stakeholders' expectations. So in information that is given to practitioners about materiality, the word impact does not appear. The second thing that I wanted to point out is that very often impact measurement is very difficult. As an example, how do you measure the efficiency of labor relations? With the numbers of days of strike, everybody knows that it's going to be influenced by the country in which you are. In China, you don't have a strike. Very often, the prioritization is made by a group of people in a room which have voted. And so it's pretty much down to the experience of the group of people that you have, and if you have included representatives of stakeholders or not. But very often, impact, we don't have it.
Other thoughts? Suleiman. Nan-Kumar, could you turn off your microphone unless you're...
Just a brief idea about how to cross-check the stakeholder consultation with impact identification. Your example, Michelle, it's a very good example. How to measure efficiency regarding relationship with labor representatives. You can cross-check with the outcomes from your grievance mechanism, for instance. And you can cross-check with other sources of secondary data. But this is the type of thing that requires specialists or a very precise profile of consultants, or even if you do not have impact on labor relations, but you do have impact on health and safety, you can identify you as a company or as a global company. The impact identification it's complex, but it's not that hard. What is very hard is to measure and assess the impact, the relevance and significance. But then there are other tools where you can cross-check with the systems in place to consult and to get feedback from stakeholders. So this is the type of thing that I would expect to have heard from the trainers, because there are a lot of examples. There are specialists, so we should reinforce this message. You should be more diligent in terms of giving examples on how to apply the principles. Thank you.
Okay, we've, Dwight, yes.
Well, I'll be very brief so we can move on. The problem with the measuring impact is that a lot of the indicators are just not valid indicators, and the strike example is one of them. And I think that that there's a lot of bad indicators in the area of human rights, that they just aren't valid, and I'm not so sure how important it is to measure these things. I think you have to look more at the qualitative aspect rather than and if people are wrapped up in the idea that what can't be measured can't be managed, I think that they're bringing the wrong sort of thought paradigm here, because they're looking at what might be very appropriate in say, certain business activities, but it really doesn't matter in terms of human rights. You really have to look at sort of precautionary things and processes and that sort of thing.
Thank you. Well, we actually spent quite a bit of this discussion looking at the question of training, which is not within the GSSB's gift to deliver. I suppose the question for us to be thinking about is there are quite a lot of things that exist in a kind of dialogue between the GSSB and the GRI Secretariat. I suppose the real message around this particular one is that it seems clear that while it is quite appropriate for training to be delivered by the GRI Secretariat, we need to have confidence as to the technical robustness of some of the content in order to ensure that the standards are well understood by the people who need to be able to implement them. We may be making some suppositions here, but I think if we look at some of the challenges that we saw in the monitoring program around some of these very, very basic concepts. I don't mean basic as in simple, I mean basic as in fundamental and foundational concepts around impact and materiality and so forth, that if you don't have, you will not be able to do the higher order kind of activities through the standards. I think, you know, as we think about our work plan, let's reflect on not just the content of standards themselves, but whatever we need to do to support their uptake, and whatever is appropriate through our role as a standard-setting body to support their uptake. But I think this might be one thing that we want to flag for ongoing conversation with the Secretariat around how we sort of go back and forth as organizations to ensure that the whole package of what we're presenting to the market is fit for purpose and is well understood and can be robustly and practically applied. Does anyone else want to offer any kind of overall observations about the conversation that we've had so far over the course of the last day? In that case, I want to ask Bastian to take us then to the next piece of our discussion, which is going to be the proposal around project prioritization.
Yes, thank you, Judy. And this is connecting to a discussion we had in the March in-person meeting. The due process protocol sets out certain expectations on how the GSB should be going about prioritizing subject matters for the work program. And I think on a very high level, if I had to summarize what has happened since the inception of the GSB, is that you have been focused on two things. One is to take care of legacy issues, because the transition to standards was decided and there are certain subject matters that had been practically decided on also in terms of the standard setting agenda. And you had a very close interaction with the governance bodies of GRI that were in place before the GSB came about, so the SC and the board, also in terms of developing an initial work program. But what is set out in the due process protocol, and we go through that in a moment, is also the expectation that you as a governance body establish an ongoing dialogue with a set of key stakeholders to inform your work program going forward. And I think against the background that right now we've, through your decisions on work programs so far, and projects specifically so far, we've committed most of the staff capacity already. This is a discussion that we can start now with key stakeholders, which will enable us maybe in a year's time to actually shed light on the time horizon 2018 to it's 21 probably that we're discussing then already, because it's a 3-year work program on a rolling basis. So just want to walk you briefly to the due process protocol, and there, as you've seen, there's 3 layers basically in the due process protocol that pertain to this discussion. Fundamental principles, then there are a couple of paragraphs that set out the basic rules, and then there is detail on the specific elements of the due process. So for the fundamental principle, one thing that is set out very clearly, that the ambition is that you design your work program and everything you do in relation to authoritative intergovernmental instruments and their interpretations, and you're responsive to documented, widely held expectations of behavior relating to social, ecological, environmental, and economic responsibilities. And I think, if you apply this and you apply that to the review projects that you've decided upon, we've gone through that cycle. We've looked into what's relevant in the human rights space, what's relevant related to economic performance and contribution of organizations and so on. What we probably didn't do is take a step back and just made up a balance of this is what's happening globally vis-a-vis relevant intergovernmental instruments and also rising expectations towards business outside these specific subject matters that had been discussed before by the TSC and then in the early days of the GSSB. So this is an expectation that is formulated there, and one way it is proposed to identify potential new projects is a consideration of these developments, then comments received by the GRI board and directors as advised by the SC, and any stakeholder. And for the part C here in the paragraph 4, we have conducted public consultations also so far, so that we tick that box as well. But it is now really how are we responsive to a wider set of consideration when it comes to national and international developments that we need to render into the work program discussions, and how can we go about that. And here, then very specific in the due process protocol, there is it sets out that your strategy review, so your work program review, involves a formal survey of those whom the GSB deems to be key stakeholders. And that's the missing link right now. We haven't identified a set of key stakeholders, institutions that you would like the standards division, I think, to engage with on a regular basis, inform those stakeholders about your current work program underway, but more importantly also get their feedback on what's on the horizon and what should be considered by the GSSB going forward. And it is in that space that we would like to request your input. What we're bringing to the meeting, also given that we lost a bit of time yesterday, is first and foremost a listing of categories of key stakeholders. And that's has been developed based on the stakeholder groups that we have in the composition of this governance body, and actually the composition of all governance bodies of GI, and then also adding to a nuance in terms of certain groups that, from a standards division perspective, we feel should be involved. We're not trying to solve the who exactly is under these categories today. We're proposing to put this out to you between now and mid of October, so that in the next call we can actually discuss specific suggestions for institutions to be contacted under the specific categories. But what we want to focus on today is your initial take on whether this list stakeholder groups or stakeholder categories is actually something that you feel is complete and reflective of the outreach activities that we should be planning. And just a quick note, so for some of the things, like for example, reporting standard setters and frameworks and initiatives, you have given feedback already as part of the work program discussion, and it will be merely, I think, a completion of that exercise. For other things, take for example, when you go back here, the data and business information providers that we're suggesting here, investors, regional and national policy makers. We haven't discussed as a GSSB who are the groups that we should be in touch with, and there are many different approaches you could take. For investors, you could talk only to the largest asset owners. Maybe you want to engage with asset managers. You could decide that in that space it's actually relevant to talk to the institutions that Evan just mentioned about the World Federation of Exchanges, or do they actually sit more in the regulatory space? So these kind of discussions need to happen going forward. But first and foremost, it is now about saying, okay, this seems to be the right categorization, or we're missing something here, and it would be good to have feedback on that. And what we will do is, what we have done is, in the background, we populated then these categories with the institutions that GI has engaged on traditionally, that we in standard setting process have engaged on, and we would play that back to you as the invitation to add to it or provide feedback on. But that's after the meeting. That's in between now and the next meeting. So the question here is really, is that set of key stakeholders and broader categories complete, or are there others that we're missing?
Can I ask Bastian, just backing up slightly? We saw that the GSSB takes advice from, among other places, the GRI Board of Directors as advised by the Stakeholder Council. There is, in my understanding, there's nothing to prevent us from directly speaking with the Stakeholder Council either. And I think there's quite a lot of membership overlap between the Stakeholder Council and that sort of category list that you have there. That's not to say that the Stakeholder Council is sort of the only list of stakeholders that GRI should consult, but they are an already assembled, well sort of clued in group of stakeholders who are quite aware of the work and the priorities and so forth. And perhaps we ought to, just as a kind of process mechanism, try to find ways to be as proactive as possible in engaging that group of stakeholders, as well as kind of bulking out this list a little bit further.
Yeah, so I think I would agree with that. Also, traditionally, since the inception of the GSB, we have presented all your work program ideas as well as projects to the SC and solicited feedback because it is required in the due process through the board, but we always look for the direct engagement. So next week when they're in town, we will talk to them again about this. What's interesting about the SC is some of the groups here are probably very well represented. For others, and when you look, for example, at the intergovernmental organizations, policymakers, the academic and research institution, data and business information providers, these are groups that maybe have one representative or none on the. So there's probably more work. But what I could offer is also to reflect a bit on that and maybe share out also the current membership of the SC, so that you have that as background when you look at this. But maybe one last note about it was the SC. What we're also seeing is that we have very focused feedback on individual projects by individuals from the SC, but less of a, let's say, high-level direction in terms of where to go, which are, for example, if you look again at what was set out as the basic principle, so far we haven't gotten any feedback that points to authoritative intergovernmental instruments other than the UN guiding principles, which you had on the radar already, but there is no structural feedback of that nature coming from them.
Okay, Sulema.
The first category includes standard setters, frameworks, and initiatives besides reporting. So I'm talking about ISO and others types of, because you're talking about reporting standard setters or as a whole standard setters?
Yeah, so the way we've looked at it right now is exactly that. Is it only reporting or not? Could be, it could be a bit broader, but there is a risk also where we start to have discussions that are maybe important for positioning of our project outcomes, but not so much for informing what they're not the right people to talk to when you want to learn more about instruments that will affect your agenda. ISO is probably not exactly in that space. They are very important for a certain subject matter, like OH&S, because they're developing a standard in that space, and there is a good network to reach out to. But can they inform your work program overall? Maybe, maybe not. Yeah.
So you're talking about frameworks on reporting and initiatives only on reporting.
That was the idea.
Okay.
Dwight, break the silence.
My initial reaction is that, first of all, that seems to be a good list, but not every category is equal. You know, some categories are more important than others. And then the second thought is probably one of the most important is also one of the most problematic, which is civil society. And part of the reason for that is they're not necessarily the right mix of representative organizations, and in some subjects they're just the absence of civil society in society is a very big deal, but that's my only two thoughts.
Maybe just to add to that, so for civil society representation towards GI processes, we have been, I think, fairly consistent as soon as we move discussions to an issue level to involve, in most cases, the right players. But to have an ongoing discussion with a wider set of high-profile civil society organizations, I think that's something that we've been struggling with. So to learn more about their agenda and their outlook for the coming years. And I think that is something that the group could profit from a lot if we were to establish an understanding of who we want to engage in these discussions. And some, of course, of the more prominent civil society players, they have nowadays portfolios that span very many, if not all, the subject matters that we're covering. And some are highly relevant, but they are specific to just one or two issues that we're addressing in the set of standards. So what we want to do is we will pre-populate the list of organizations here. We will share that out with the invitation that you provide feedback, and we will then discuss that. I think the number of organizations we end up with will determine how long this process takes, but what we currently have in mind is that we would like to ask 2 or 3 members from the board to come forward to form a committee to think about a survey approach together with us. And that is, we will have to standardize these engagements in a way, but there will be always for this particular groups also specific questions we want to ask. But what I had in mind with the approach overall is that we would feedback early next year, basically the outcomes of these discussions in a structured way to you. And to give guidance on what that could look like, I would like to involve 2 or 3 members in a discussion between now and the November call. So in October, we will discuss the list of stakeholders for the first time, and in November, I would like to have a survey ready for discussion with the GSSB and the full list of stakeholders that we want to engage, and we would then roll that out. and probably conduct the interviews. Well, maybe we can do some of them in December and late November, but in my experience, that's always very difficult. But certainly in January, February, we could pick that up and schedule that ahead of time, and then we could actually roll this out structurally. With the aim to have at the in-person meeting in March an update on these conversations for you. And then we would move to a different level of detail, I think, when it comes to future work program discussions. You could also give guidance on who we should engage with on a more structural basis for the coming years out of this set of key stakeholders. So that's the proposal. If there are people that want to come forward to think with us about the survey and how to Sulema, anybody else?
Yep. Any questions, comments? Non-Kumar?
Okay.
Daniel, I just had a question. I just wondered whether, sorry if I missed this, but whether we need sort of some frame the sort of questions that we're trying to answer. Would you see that as being part of
the committee?
The committee group?
Yes.
Because yeah, in my mind, that's sort of, you know, the starting point before then determining which stakeholders we want to pick out of your presumably pretty comprehensive list of relationships that GRI have already built.
That's a good point. So maybe also as part of the opportunity to provide input on the stakeholders, we can also think about a first set of questions that just basically relate to the expectations set out in the due process protocol, which we could then refine in that process as well. That's
yeah,
possible.
I mean, I guess, you know, thinking back to Tim's comments yesterday on sort of, you know, primary goal for this group being sort of maintain the integrity and the quality of the standards. Well, in my mind, then, do we want to begin to talk to other standard setters that have, you know, been through that same sort of, you know, process and what their experiences have been? So, to me, that'd be one question to ask.
Okay, so we've got Suleiman, we've got Non-Kumar. Could we have maybe Daniel? Was that you volunteering to be part of that?
I knew that would happen. Time dependent. I would like to be able to offer some help. Yeah, I think I would want to keep an eye on.
So we have a yes from
just how long your list is, and then how many interviews they're going to be. If we're talking, you know, a couple of interviews each, then I think that's absolutely doable.
I'm not even sure whether I would request the members to conduct the actual interviews. It is more the preparation so that we have your initial thoughts on what we should be focusing on. We will discuss it in the full group, and then we conduct the interviews. My experience with the different time zones and everything, this will be a year process if you conduct 60 interviews, and we try to accommodate all your travel schedules and time zones.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Sulema.
Daniel, it would be great to have a diverse point of view, mainly from investor perspective on this type of initiative. So I urge you to be a volunteer.
I believe he's had his arm twisted. Yeah. Okay.
Next is actually just the, and that's before the morning break, the review of the review of the work program, so session 2.3. And that's just on a high level to go through what has been decided last year as the work program for 2017 to 2019, without referring in any greater detail to the discussions we had during this meeting, but just to refresh on this. And the next step would then be to take stock of what are already currently committed projects, a discussion whether you're still supportive of that, and then all the additional inputs that we have received over the last day.
Okay. So this is item 10 in your pre-reading of the GSSB work program 2017 to 2019.
Yeah.
Which we're just going to, this is, as Bastian says, just to refresh our memories as to what it is that we've already said for this period of time we want to accomplish.
Yes. So I will go through the document just in the way it was presented last year. So covering A to J, the different elements. and just give quick reminders on what was the gist of the activity behind these different labels. So the first one, A, is the support of the implementation of the GRI standards. This is what we presented yesterday in the first session in terms of the launch activities, translations, and initial materials that we've developed to market the standards around the launch. This is basically coming to an end. That's the one activity that's also, when you look at the work program, we're phasing that out. Yes, there will be here and there a couple of launch events, but it is not on a structural level anymore, and it is not 3 or 4 travels for the team per month. Also, the translations, we've covered most of the languages, actually with the exception of probably one that we're still looking at, Portuguese, on hope to translate soon. So that's for the first one, with the flag that this is probably something we will discontinue as a regular activity. B and C I would like to cover in conjunction, and that is review of existing standards on a regular basis, as well as to develop additional topic-specific standards on a regular basis. We have discussed the different projects that you've committed to already, OHS and water underway, human rights starting with the approval of the technical committee, hopefully later today, economic performance approved as a project, on hold at the moment, but with further background discussions. And then also as one of the next steps, and to be discussed in the next session, a look at waste and materials probably as a separate project. So these are things that are committed, ongoing, and that fall firmly in the B. Sorry, I missed the tax and payments to government related projects. So that would be an example for C, a new subject matter, I think, that we haven't explored in that detail. And we're adding to the topics that we're covering. So these two things, basically the bulk of decisions that you've taken in terms of activities fall into these categories. And again, this is where most of the capacity of the team is applied currently. For D, develop sector-specific contents. We did come back to that a couple of times in the discussions over the last day. This is, well, has been set out as a priority for you to deal with. Addressing a gap that is a perceived gap by stakeholders, but certainly also emerging out of the discussion of the transition to standards, that there was an element missing. What we've put in the work program last year was to say, well, this will probably be something that we start in 2018. We're coming closer. I think Judy and I can report back from the recent discussion with the GIA board that currently there is still no budget allocation to get this project started. So that's a discussion we will come back to in the prioritization later, because one element is there funding to start it? The other element is whether you still want to push this agenda of saying this is really something that needs to happen as soon as possible. Under E, issue authoritative interpretations and guidance. This is ongoing. This is our work on the FAQ that you've seen, the day-to-day management of inquiries that we receive, but also probably a bit of the work that has been flagged to us in terms of how can we help the practitioners well, understand all the specifics, the basics, as Judy has said, of the standards, and that's things like the work, the training, and other things. And how can we complement these kind of offerings? This idea yesterday to say, okay, well, do we have regular check-ins with the training partners, inform them about these contents? That might fall in this element as well. Under F, we have discussed, we had long discussions, I think, over the years about that, but that there seems to be a body of work around quality of reporting. It includes, but is not exclusively related to the discussions around assurance that Tim has raised as well. So you flagged that up, and actually very much the institutions that were discussed yesterday also, they have been mentioned in the work program already. So it is later today in the next session also a discussion are you comfortable to open up that agenda and actually hire in staff to advance these discussions a bit more? Under G, last year it was discussed, we had, and we continue to have that feedback, the question whether what we've developed with the standards is actually fit for purpose for specific groups. And one group in particular that was mentioned was SMEs. I leave it at that. It is an ongoing discussion, but in the work program you have made provisions to develop guidance. We haven't started that work in any way. We don't have a proposal for even a basic approach to how we could set out the standards specifically for SMEs, and it is probably also a discussion whether or not we have sufficient feedback to take such a decision. In our interpretation right now for where we stand is we have very little adoption overall of the standards because they were released only a year ago, and we don't know whether they are fit for purpose or not for SMEs. We have programs underway where we have some first positive feedback, but it remains to be seen. Question is whether we now want to invest resources into revamping, if you will, our core product to address an audience where we're not even sure that they need a different version of that core product. Under H in the work program, we have collaboration with key partners to reduce the reporting burden and increase the uptake of the GRI standards. And the discussions we had yesterday with the TCFD fall firmly into that space, I think. That could be a continuation of that discussion, could be to look at guidance for reporters to bring these two developments together, GRI standards and the TCFD recommendations. But there are other elements here that were reflected up last year, things like the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights. We've involved them in this trajectory around the Human Rights Reporting Project, and they will be commenting on that, and they have recommended individuals to be part of our technical committee. So we're keeping these channels open. I think if I had to compare the activity that we have had behind this agenda item between the launch of the G4 and the standards, and the situation now, we have certainly not given the same level of attention to this simply because of capacity reasons. So later in the next discussion that we have, your ideas around prioritizing which institutions we should be focusing on for now under this, that would be very welcome. Under I, we have the provide technical input on programs, products, and services developed by GRI. And Tim alluded to it yesterday. Overall, the service related, I think, activities of GRI will continue to evolve. There will be more contents to be looked at, I think, by the standards division, to ensure that these are these contents that are developed for educational materials, but also service methodologies and all, are in line with the standards. And that is why we have invested heavily in that in the past. We expect that there will be more of that going forward, and it is kind of a ongoing activity that won't go away. We will have to continue to invest, also to address issues that were just flagged a couple of minutes ago, quality of training and these kind of things. One of those things to probably fine-tune these type of outcomes is to be directly involved in the development of materials. And the last item, J, on the work program is carrying out the monitoring activities and looking at emerging practice. And that is what Tamara has presented. You've given us already quite some guidance on where to focus going forward. But we see that also very much as an ongoing activity that will have to continue to inform your decision-making processes. Maybe just one last remark is the schedule that is in Annex 1 for 2017 is basically covering the standard setting projects, and that's just reflective of what we have said. What's missing here and what we've now committed to is the tax and payment to government issue. I think I'll leave it at that, and we can open for questions for the work program that was decided last year.
Okay. Clarifications, any observations that you've made, just sort of thinking about what we set out to do with this work program, what we have been able to do, what we've not been able to do, anything that has sort of come up in between then and now that you would like to think about some more? Julia.
Just a statement, I think we're doing well when I look at the priority work areas on things like, improving the quality of reporting, collaborating with partners to reduce reporting burden, obviously reviewing the GRI on a regular basis. But I think the sector-specific and thinking about the SMEs, like you said, those sorts of things maybe require more attention from the group. But I think kind of on the quality, reporting burden, collaboration front, I think, I objectively speaking, think that we're doing well.
Julia, can I follow up on that? On the, for example, the sector-specific contents, is your observation simply that we haven't made the progress that we said we wanted to make, or do we need to go back and kind of remind ourselves what was the purpose of identifying that as a priority for our work plan, and is it still valid? Where do you want to go with that one?
My observation there is just, given the conversation yesterday that we were having about the language in the FAQs around, I just think it's still a question mark in terms of what is really needed, what are even the sectors wanting from us truly. Maybe the survey approach that you outlined would help with that, but I think it's still, at least for me, a question of what GRI should be providing there and what the pace or what the timeline should look like for that one, and specifically. Not commenting on progress not made, but just thinking about the road ahead for us.
Thank you. Bastian, I had a question about item, I can't remember which one it is. It's the G, develop new guidance for specific groups of reporters. We've discussed SMEs, and I'm wondering, are there any others? SMEs seems to be the only one that we have identified as a distinct group of reporters. And do we know how broad this category potentially is?
No, I think what was discussed also as part of line 127 to 129 is there was the question last year whether there were specific guides for those in developing countries, regulatory requirements. If you look at regional approaches like the EU directive, whether you would have to address these organizations specifically that come into this because of regulatory pressures will never actually aspire to use the GRI standards in totality, at least not in the early years. And is there a special approach required? I think from the inquiries and everything we received, there's no indication that there is a particular group that would need our attention right now under this work activity.
Another thought of mine is that J, the monitoring activity, that, as you've identified, Bastian, that does seem like an ongoing activity, but to my mind, it's one that supports the rest of the work plan rather than is a kind of deliverable in its own right, I would say. No. Other comments or observations? Yes, Stian.
I think the research that was presented yesterday is extremely important to inform developments in the market and future trends that we need to follow. So certainly support continued focus on that.
Others? Okay. Fairly minimalist discussion so far on Robin, go ahead. Yeah.
It's because there's a break in the traffic, I'll say. I think the piece on, or the recommendation on other types of reporting, so the SMEs, or if it's peak industry body, membership-based pieces, I certainly think that's not something that we see a lot in the FAQs or the inbox, I suppose, as it's being reflected to us, and perhaps that's something that can be swept into the survey with the stakeholders. I think, though, the sector work is a bit different to that, although we can explore it through the survey piece. But I think that there's the sector guidance or additional guidance for sectors seems to come up in a variety of feedback mechanisms. So I would think that's something that we should probably work our way through sooner rather than later and maybe at least get a position on whether we sweep it into the survey or put it on hold until the results of a survey, or progress it in some other way. But it seems that it comes up in a lot of conversations and in different ways, and a lot of requests coming through. I'm just checking whether that's actually true, or everyone else is seeing that as well.
And in fact, I mean, this has been something that we've talked about quite a bit in recent weeks and months. I mean, I wonder if it isn't worth our just sort of reviewing what has been the rationale for that being on our list of priorities for as long as it has been. What evidence are we pointing to tell us that this is needed by particular markets, particular audiences? Is it simply that we had sector contents previously under G4 and that we haven't done anything with, that we've sort of believed, well, we must do something with them now that they're standards, or can we point to real sort of evidence around that? And I think we probably owe it to ourselves to make sure that we understand, why we were there in the first place. Bastian, are we in a position to discuss that at all at this point, or is it a bit too sort of complicated to?
Well, no, I think I can give a summary of what we're seeing related to that point. That's definitely something we could do. Is it, because I take it that for right now there are no questions about the work program as such anymore, right? But it is more a discussion of individual elements. Right.
I feel as though that's where we're heading with this. I've got Attila and Kirsten who would like to make some comments. So Attila, would you like to?
Well, as GRI's mission is indeed to empower decision that creates value for social, environmental, and governance purposes, and seeing the emergence of the big data and, as we discussed, the technology, beside reducing the reporting burden, I think in order to provide true value to the communities, to academia, to decision makers, to regulators, I mean, going as digital as possible and being at click reach of desire for all sustainability related data globally should be one of the emerging agenda items for GSSB as well. I don't know whether we should consider discussing this in this platform or maybe in the any other business section, but I think we have to maybe establish an internal task force, the few sponsors here, to see how we can resource both from a human capital perspective and also budget, organization, and governance standpoint. So I would like to bring this up to our agenda.
Recommendation, Bastian, on where we might take that up in the discussion?
Yeah, I would propose that if we move now through the discussion on understanding what we set out last year, and then in the next step discuss sector, maybe that digital element, and there are a couple of other things that were flagged over the last days that we didn't dive into the detail, and we can definitely discuss that.
Kirsten.
My reflections when reading through the work program from last year is that in some areas we are behind schedule, but there are good reasons for that. But altogether, I believe that the work program is just as relevant today as it was 1 year ago, and that we should simply keep up the good work.
Thank you. Any other overall thoughts on the work program? We're a little bit ahead of schedule. Should we keep moving? Or yeah. Okay. Let's
maybe a couple of maybe a couple of more inputs then from me in terms of what you've committed to. So these are ongoing projects, and I think what we anticipated in advance of the meeting that there might be a discussion about deprioritizing some of them. So far, we haven't had that feedback. So I've put on one slide what you're committed to in terms of standard setting projects. We're aiming to wrap up OH&S and water by Q2 next year. We are starting human rights now, and we are I think to Michelle's earlier point, this will span for sure into 2019. We've now projected that probably the completion of phase 1 and phase 2 will take us probably to the end of 2019 actually for this particular project. In a similar vein, we're looking at tax and payments to governments and economic performance. These stretch fairly long into the 2019 as well, because they're probably efforts that need to be considered in conjunction. The public consultation will be shared between all the economic subject matters probably, and so we expect that the actual project will run and can only be completed late in 2019. And for effluents and waste materials, this discussion that we had yesterday, or initiated yesterday, it seems to be a logical follow-up if we want to do it. This is more time-bound. This is really a follow-up activity. It's probably, in terms of timing, more in line with what we had for OH&S and water, because it's focused. There don't seem to be repercussions beyond that subject matter. And so the lead time will be about 18 months from project inception to delivering a final outcome. That's what we anticipate right now. In terms of other ongoing projects, just want to highlight again that indeed what you have in the work program, so these interpretations and guidance is an ongoing activity that doesn't go away. I think we can discuss a lot about how to use these things that come through these channels and how to bring that back again into training and other things, but we will have to do that there's a very real demand for that interaction with stakeholders, and that's not going away.
Can I ask you, Bastian, to give the GSSB a little bit of context around what exactly does the technical input that you're asked to provide on the GRI Secretariat side look like? What is the standards division called upon to do?
Yes. So
and what volume and regularity, and you know, as much as you can kind of provide on that.
Yeah. So I think there was there's a range of things from checking contents of the trainings, e-modules, and that's not the educational approach, right? This is more really just fact-checking materials that are set out by GRI. We issue a range of publications, for example, how the GRI standards relate to the EU directive, how the GRI standards relate to, I think we have white papers, how the GRI standards relate to certain SDG-related initiatives, these kind of things. And that's usually where we are directly involved in fact-checking all the statements we make about the standards, but also try to avoid that we're coming up with contents that are actually probably not helpful in the implementation of the standards, because they're setting out a different path. They're specific to a certain group, but would actually contradict contents that are set out in the standards. That has happened a lot, I think, over the course of the years with GI. If I had to put a it is also simple things like we have on an ongoing basis with the membership program a series of webinars. We are supporting the standards pioneers, a group of more than 100 companies that want to implement the GI standards, and Tamara here is developing this program with the membership team. So these kind of inputs you're looking at here. What we anticipate, if we move into more service creation, then we will have to sit around the table also early in that process. Between 10 and 15% of the time, I think, if you average it out, but there were moments, for example, last summer, when we just completed your approval of the, where easily 30% of the time went into just helping others to make sense of what we had decided here. Yeah? So there are peaks, but I would describe it right now between 10 and 15% of the time. Yeah.
Thank you.
So it's significant.
I'm sorry, I interrupted you in the middle of this slide here to do that.
Yeah, no. I think on the authoritative interpretations and guidance, this is just the ongoing work that we do to put the FAQ out, to flag things to you that would need immediate attention. If so far nothing has occurred where we say we need to actually issue an interpretation and say there's something factually wrong in the standards, that it is not conducive to implementation of the standards, therefore we need to course correct. and set something out officially. That hasn't happened, but we have to keep monitoring this. And then the last item is what we talked about in quite some depth with Tamara yesterday, the ongoing monitoring activity. And again, here, right now, I think Tamara is working on that about 50% of her time, and then we have 2 colleagues that help with that. I would hope that on average we have between 1 and 1.5 FTEs constantly on this. But the success of this will probably also depend a lot on how much we can involve external research parties. The more we can rely on them, the less investment we have probably in terms of running the actual research activity.
Kent.
Yeah, so I'm wondering, so we're doing this research. I really think it's great to do the research, but again, I don't understand the process for the results to be disseminated. That is, you know, would the GSSB somehow, if we need to do some further explaining about what materiality means, is it something we would do, or is it something that you would tell the GRI that they needed to develop some training on? You know, it seems if we're going to do all this research, which is great, we need to think about, you know, specifically how it's going to be disseminated, that the results are going to be disseminated.
Yeah, so I think right now, there are definitely the mechanisms, the channels that we have established, like the training program and others, and I think your guidance yesterday was clear that we should be feeding into these processes much more regularly. But there is something that historically that we were not able to overcome. We're probably a lot better positioned now, but this is this direct connection to the report preparers in particular, and those that assist report preparers. We had, until the launch of the standards, no contact information of all those that use the GI standards. This has changed, but we're not utilizing that at the moment. So we have now about 35,000 contacts of those that are users of the standards, and we have to think about ways probably to also educate the users directly with the outcomes of this research activity. For example, with the FAQs that we've discussed yesterday, there are quite a number. They're easy to probably summarize and send out to these people and provide directly to them without going through a training program. This should also happen, but we could also provide that guidance more directly. So I think what I take from this meeting is also that it's good that we do this work, but we need to actually think about how it reaches those that actually need this type of information, and that there is a gap right now. And the second aspect of your question, the guidance, if you look at materiality in all these things, that would need to come from here, from the standards division and the GSSB. That's not, I think if you think about case studies and everything, that may be something for a membership program, but actual guidance and to the earlier point that we're rather slim on that particular piece, you would need to initiate that process. And then it's coming back also under the things that we should be discussing, whether you want us to invest in this in the coming months. Maybe just then just one thing to wrap up the ongoing activity is really the one piece that we can drop also to Kirsten's point. This seems to be reflective of what we should still be doing. One thing that I would basically scrap from the programming that we set out and send out now also to SC and others to comment is that implementation of the GI standards, all the launch things, that's over, and I don't want to also commit the team's time on such a structural basis to continue to fly around. I think we've done that now.
Good. Okay. Other discussion points or questions? Okay, I think we'll take a break now. Let's, as I say, we're a few minutes ahead of schedule, not any kind of earth-shattering amount. So let's go to 11:15. Please be ready to go back into session by 11:15. Then we'll turn off the webcast for the moment. Thank you.